Hi, my name's Kathy Miller, and this week we're looking at making newspapers for your layout. Why do you need newspapers? Well, they just add to that city clutter. Well, starting in the real world as always, I think we all know what newspapers look like and how they yellow as they age, but it's always worth checking a few photos to make sure your memory is perfectly correct. So what do you need to make your newspapers? Well, first up, you need to get some scale size newspapers. And the easiest way to do that is just to Google newspaper and look on an image search. That produces a whole host of images, and you want to pick one that's close. I mean, you won't be able to read it when it's done. It doesn't become that fine. But what you need to do is produce something that's for your area, your locale, so you can say, this is right. Once you've done that, download and save those images onto your hard drive. Import them into a word processing program. I used Word, and make sure that the size on all of them is about scale newspaper size. Now I decided mine were going to be a foot across, which is quite reasonable I think for a newspaper. So they're a foot across, which is 0.14 of an inch. So I made the width of all of my images 0.14 of an inch. Then you need to replicate them 100 times because you want to print as many as possible on one sheet. Once you've done that, send them off to print. Now, I used a layout paper to print on. If you can get your printer to work on tissue paper, even better, but you want something quite fine. A thick paper is not really appropriate at this point because it becomes much harder later to get it to work. And I will say, if you have access to a laser printer, and actually these are black and white, so even a black and white laser printer, the printing is more robust when you come to glue it. When you glue ink cartridge printed paper, sometimes it can run if you're not careful, so that's just something to watch. So now I've got my sheet of printed paper, I just need to cut them out. So that's just a bit of fun work with a ruler and knife. Because I've printed quite a block, I can do them a section at a time. Okay, so these are all my newspapers, and I'm just going to gather them up and take them upstairs and put them on a road that's now fixed on my layout. So I'm going to add some newspapers to my layout. This is the road that I did in the last few weeks of videos. You can see I've screwed it down at the back and it's well glued at the front, and it's going to go into this tunnel which needs a little shadow box to contain it. So I'm just going to add a few newspapers onto this scene. So putting a little blob of, this is very dilute white glue and water. About 30-70, but it may actually be a little bit less than that. I've got my newspapers here, and all I do is I get my tweezers, I pick one up, and I let it soak for a minute or two, but I try and keep it wet underneath, not on top. If you keep it, if you let it get too wet on top, there's a danger that your ink might run. So when it's a little bit damp, you literally just put it up against the edge and you squidge it in. And you want it to bend like a real newspaper would. Now we've got 3 or 4 different types of newspaper, so it doesn't look too repetitive, so make sure you use different ones. Here we go. Started a little pile of them here. Cinch them down into there. Okay, I'm just going to put one in here because it's a corner where there's loads of stuff accumulated. Make sure they don't sit on top of the grass too much. You know, the grass is springy because it's static grass, so you need to push them down well. So there we go. That's how simple it is to put newspapers onto a city or any sort of area where you might get newspapers blowing down and they haven't been cleaned up. You know, I like to think this pile here, well, this pile is just a naughty newspaper boy who dumped his and couldn't be bothered to hand them out to all the people. Okay, so the final step, and it's optional whether you want to do it, is to just make these papers a little bit yellower. Now, paper ages over time, but they never go bright yellow, so you're looking for something quite subtle. Now I've got a neutral MIG wash, and I like MIG washes. This, I haven't really shaken it, so it's now got a bit of a sort of brownish tone to it. And I'm not necessarily going to do it on all of them, but I'm just going to put a little drip on to just tie them in. And at this point you can see it's running into the surroundings as well. So there we go, just a bit. I don't really want them to stand out horrendously. That's actually just a bit. But I'm going to leave one over there still white because, you know, well, actually a couple still white, because paper comes down at all times. So you want some that look really old and some that look a little bit less old. So there we go. That's all it takes to do newspapers. This is the final result. Just a little bit of extra subtle detail, another level to add to your layout or diorama.
This week on the Mini Cathys, mill-scale Cathy decides to beam herself up.
Well, you know I'm a common kind of military scale. I'm also a sci-fi scale. And I watched, Cathy was watching the, big Cathy though, wasn't it? Big Cathy. She was watching Star Trek First Contact the other day, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun if someone could beam me somewhere different? So I'm going to beam myself to another planet. Exciting! Can't wait. Here we go. Ooh! 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 Isn't it exciting? Wow! I mean, like, wow! Like, wow! I mean, woo! I wonder if there's any aliens.
I do wonder whether there's any aliens on that planet. Time will tell. Tune in next week to find out.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you have, then subscribe to me on YouTube. Alternatively, like me on Facebook, Cathy Millett Modelling, or my website, cathymillett.co.uk. See you next week.